This is Greg Soden. Thank you so much for listening. As a longtime high school religious studies teacher, finding texts that make sense of some of the world's religious traditions that are accessible to students is one of my highest priorities. When I read such a book, perhaps one that contains humor, reveals the author's situatedness and personal journeys through a religion, as well as a clear and concise bit of history, I immediately take notice and want to tell everyone I know what I've found. Buddhish, a guide to the 20 most important Buddhist ideas for the curious and skeptical mind by Dr. Pierce Salguero, is one such book. It tracks Salguero's personal journey through experiences of Buddhist practice in Thailand, through his PhD and teaching experiences of talking to students about Buddhism, and concepts such as non-self, bodhisattvas, refuge, and more in digestible ways in chapters that are perfectly concise, under 10 pages, and can be read and discussed often within a single class period with my students. Of course, this book is relevant to far more than readers than just teachers and their students. Salguero's book is digestible for beginners and knowledgeable folks alike, as noted in the subtitle, for the curious and skeptical. In this conversation, Dr. Salguero and I also touch on his other new book, A Global History of Buddhism and Medicine, out now from Columbia University Press. So this episode is a 2-in-1. Dr. C Pierce Salguero is a scholar of Buddhism, Asian medicine, and cross-cultural exchange. He has a PhD from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and teaches at Penn State University's Abington College. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation on Buddhish, as well as a global history of Buddhism and medicine. Dr. Pierce Salguero, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be speaking with you.
And I'm wondering if we can just start off by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience who's listening, however you see fit.
Sure. I'm an associate professor of Asian history and religious studies at Penn State's Abington College, which is right outside of Philadelphia. And I've been an academic for I guess the last 20 years. And before that, I was briefly a practitioner of traditional Thai medicine for several years. And so I think my books that we're going to be talking about today kind of represent, in some ways, a coming together of those two different interests in Asian medicine and in Asian history and Buddhism.
Wonderful. Well, and if I'm not mistaken, this is your first appearance ever on a podcast, correct?
Yes, that's true. That is true. I have a couple of YouTube videos here and there that have come out from interviews with people, but yeah, this is my first time on a podcast. So thank you so much I'm glad to be with you for this inaugural event.
I'm so delighted. And I hope this is the beginning of many appearances that you get to do to talk about these new books that you have out, because you just have such an interesting array of work, which we'll dive into here in a little bit. But before we get into your actual books, you study and write about Buddhism, and I'm wondering how you originally got interested in Buddhism in general. What was that path like for you as a curious person to discover this tradition that you've made a profession out of reading and researching?
Yeah. So I became interested in religions really, really early. I grew up in an atheist household. My family moved from South America to the U.S. when I was 7. And we didn't really have any kind of religious traditions that we practiced in the family. But for some reason, right around 11, 12 years old, I started getting into religions and particularly into Asian religions. So throughout high school and college, I was, reading, taking courses and reading for fun about Taoism and various forms of Hinduism and eventually Buddhism. It wasn't the first tradition to really grab me, but in college, I started to become more interested in Buddhism. But all of this was kind of textbook-based, book-based knowledge. I didn't have any practice whatsoever, any experience with living traditions of Asian religions
Mm-hmm.
until I graduated from college and went to Southeast Asia with a friend of mine for what was ostensibly supposed to be a 6-month trip, mainly scuba diving in the Philippines and Indonesia. But I became at that time, I just became hooked by Buddhism, and my friend wound up after 6 months going back to the U.S., and I wound up staying in Asia and lived in Thailand mostly for the next 4 years, and
Mm.
practiced. I stayed for residential retreats at like both monasteries and meditation centers in different parts of Thailand. Yeah, and it just kind of that launched me on my way to being interested in both the practice, but then eventually also the history and the philosophy of Buddhism as well.
Oh, I love it. Well, I want to linger on this travel aspect and your time in Thailand. And I'm wondering if you can just tell me a little bit about some of the like what tradition you pursued, maybe some of the places that you went that were important. I just love hearing travel stories so much. And I'm wondering if you can, reflect on that a little bit with me.
Yeah, sure. So in Thailand is a Theravada Buddhist country. So I was mainly exposed to Buddhism initially through the Theravada tradition. And like I said earlier, I spent some amount of time both in meditation centers as well as staying as a resident in monasteries. I was never a monk, but a lay, like a long-term lay resident. And my experience in Thailand was sort of back and forth between more secular meditation centers that were associated with the Goenka organization. So less overtly Buddhist and more sort of the kind of what we would call Buddhist modernism, or a more modernized form of Buddhism. And then going and spending time in Thai temples, which are much more sort of traditionally Theravada. So I, was kind of gravitating back and forth between those two different kinds of environments. The other thing I was really involved in at the time, actually, just as much as studying Buddhism, was learning traditional medicine. And I said I eventually became a practitioner of traditional Thai medicine, but I was spending a lot of time with learning in both sort of formal and informal settings, learning Thai massage, which is kind of like assisted yoga therapy, maybe is the best way to describe it, as well as herbal medicine. And I got really fascinated by the intersections between the traditions of Buddhism and the traditions of healing that I was being exposed to in Thailand. So there were a lot of really interesting areas where those two overlapped, some of which had to do with the ritual practices and spiritual healing practices that were being done by healers, and some of it which had to do with the health-related practices that I saw in the monastic setting. So those are two kind of areas where these two fields overlapped. And yeah, I was interested as a practitioner and as a enthusiast at the time. But eventually, after being in Thailand for about 4.5 years or so, at the end, by that time, I had really decided to go into this more from the historical perspective, more of a scholarly perspective. And so I came back to the States and re-enrolled in graduate school, and that kind of represented this sort of fork in the road for me. And I eventually, moved away from practice and more into academic study.
When you left Thailand and came back to the United States, this connects into the book that we're going to get into, Buddhish, here in just a moment. But when you left Thailand, did you know that you were not going to continue pursuing practice as like as an actual person who identifies as Buddhist? Did you know that that was something that you were feeling for your own personal beliefs when you were leaving Thailand?
I think when I left Thailand, I wasn't yet at that moment. when I first got back to the States, I went to graduate school. I did a master's degree part-time for about 4 years. And it was really over that period of time that I sort of, I both was working as a practitioner of traditional Thai massage and herbal medicine, and was teaching courses. But at the same time was taking classes on the history of Buddhism and on the history of East Asia and so forth. And it was really over that 4 year period that there was sort of a transition from primarily seeing myself as a practitioner to primarily seeing myself as an academic. So in 2005, when I started my PhD program at Johns Hopkins University, it's in Maryland, and in that state, I was not legally allowed to practice Thai massage anymore. And I very willingly went to Maryland and made that choice to at that moment to sort of leave behind my life as a practitioner and become a full-time academic.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So what have you been at the same university teaching as a professor the entire course of your academic career? What was that like getting out of grad school?
Yeah, I had a 1 year pre-doctoral fellowship before I finished up my dissertation at a small college in Syracuse, New York.
Down the road from me. Nice.
Yeah, I was at Lemoyne College.
Cool.
And I was there for 9 months, and then got the job that I have now. And so I've been at Abington College for the last 12 years or so.
I love it. Well, let's talk about a couple of books you have out. The first book, you have a few new books out, which essentially have come out at the same time, which is wonderful. And I want to start with the book Buddhish, a guide to the 20 most important Buddhist ideas for the curious and skeptical, which is out now from Beacon Press. And personally, I'm loving this book. And I also want to say up front that I love the fact that you have an audiobook available as well, because I've been listening to the audiobook performance, but also reading the physical book. And I have absolutely loved this book so far. And this seems almost like a career culminating work, like that someone who has lived and studied the tradition in a seeker and an academic manner could have written. And so this is the kind of book that I would love to use with high school students in a way as well, because it's so accessible. But I want to know a little bit about the story behind this book and how this book took shape for you and how you got the momentum going to pursue the idea for the book Buddhish.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you're enjoying it. And I also am happy that you see it as being a good fit for high school students. And the book did really emerge out of me teaching courses on Buddhism for quite some time now. Mm-hmm. So I have been teaching both within the college setting, but then also teaching workshops on Buddhism to practitioners of traditional Asian medicine. I've been doing that for, since I got back from Thailand. So 20, 25 years at this, or 24 years at this point. And as well as I teach, occasionally courses for public libraries and other kinds of community institutions around in the area where I live. And so I have been for many, many years dissatisfied with the textbooks that are available on Buddhism. And the textbooks, in my experience, are they have been too dry, too hard to read, maybe a little too disengaged, a little too academic in their presentation for my purposes in the kinds of courses and the kinds of students that I've had. I've often found that the students are alienated by the textbook. And on the other hand, looking for introductions to Buddhism that are not written by academics, but are written by practitioners of Buddhism, I have been often dissatisfied with the way that they'll just present one particular Buddhist tradition, or they'll have a very heavy-handed sort of doctrinal approach to Buddhism that is particular to their own sectarian affiliation.
Mm.
And so what I was really longing for was a book that was as accessible and engaging and personable as some of the Dharma books that are out there, but that was at the same time presenting sort of objective, more historical, more nuanced, and maybe more critical material.
Mm-hmm.
And it just didn't seem to exist. And I kept waiting for it to emerge. And, I eventually decided to write that book myself. So that's really what Buddhish is intended to be, a sort of, objective, sort of scholarly perspective on Buddhism, but told in a way that's really lighthearted and personal and involves a lot of sort of my stories from my own experience and some thought experiments and other kinds of other kinds of presentations of the material that are a little more accessible for younger people as well as for sort of general audiences that aren't necessarily committed to this very academic approach to Buddhism, nor are they necessarily committed to becoming Buddhists.
Yes. Well, and that lightheartedness, I think, is what makes the book so interesting to me and makes me want to, have my own high school students read passages from it. And the title itself is even got some humor in there. Can you go ahead and explain the title Buddhish and how that kind of reappears throughout the course of the text and why the title is important?
Yeah. It's a little bit of a joke. I say at the beginning of the book that, at one point I would have called myself Buddhist, that was a long time ago. And now, I consider myself a fan and also a critic of Buddhism. I have, it's played a major role in my life, and I've have a lot of deep interest and respect, and have had a lot of very positive experiences myself with Buddhism. And on the other hand, I've also, learned through the academic study of Buddhism about some of the dark side and some of the problems, both historically and today with within the Buddhist tradition. And so, it's a way of kind of a nod to my appreciation for the tradition, while not necessarily signing up for all of the theories and all of the beliefs and all of the identity that goes along with, calling oneself Buddhist.
Gotcha. I'm wondering if you have any like favorite parts of the book or favorite chapters that you kind of had a really good time digesting and putting down on paper and editing. Like, were there any like favorite parts that you personally have?
I had a lot of fun writing this book. Just the book on the whole it's just such a different project than writing an academic book. And I was able to use a very different voice than I normally write in. And so, I enjoyed, as I was writing it, visualizing or like imagining that I was explaining Buddhism to my brother or my sister or one of my teenage daughters or to my uncle or to a friend, just an ordinary person that isn't an academic, that isn't Buddhist, that doesn't necessarily meditate, that isn't really predisposed to accepting or even being interested in Buddhism, but being able to sort of imagine that I'm having a conversation with them while I was writing it, to tell them what I think is interesting about this tradition and why I've spent so much of my life thinking about it and working on it, even if I'm not card carrying devotee of Buddhism.
Sure.
So it wasn't so much a particular chapter, more so than just like a kind of a running thread throughout the book, where I was imagining my audience in this very sort of like conversational way.
Awesome. Well, one of the concepts that I personally have loved teaching about during my own units with high school seniors when talking about Buddhism is the concept of no self. And that was such a fun chapter for me because I was thinking immediately how well that chapter would work within my own class. Because it's always like, I'm always asking my own students, okay, so like, where do you see yourself and this like unchangeable part of your identity? And is it somewhere like behind your eyes where your consciousness resides? Can you put your finger on it and point to the self? If you chop off an arm, are you less of the self than before? And so I always love asking questions like that because the students are like, oh my goodness, what is the self? And then what you get down to is it's like, I really can't identify anything. And I'm wondering how, you personally like go about teaching things like that in your own classes. And if you have sort of like things that you like to do within your own classes to talk about some of the beliefs and within Buddhism that are so intriguing to people who have never really dove into it before.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the thought experiments that you were just talking about are similar to some of the thought experiments I use with my students. But not non-self. I mean, it's such a core idea within basically all forms of Buddhism, and it's essential that you really have to talk about it. You really have to get this across to students one way or another in an intro course on Buddhism. But this is one of the places where I earlier described myself as a fan and a critic of Buddhism, and I feel like this particular concept, isn't always the most helpful concept for teenagers or people in their young 20s to be hit over the head with. And what I mean is, I think at that age, people are just really starting to come into their own and really starting to emerge as selves from under the shadow of their parents or their, schooling or their upbringing. It's a time of life where they're really learning to stand up as individuals and individuate from their, childhood.
Right.
Where they're really, I think, in need of in many cases, in need of support in forming their new selves. And along comes this concept of Buddhism, which if it was deployed in a less skillful way in a classroom, it could lead students to walk away thinking, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of being an individual. I'm not, worthy of being a separate person, as I think it's one of these areas where non-self really matters how you present it to a teenager versus 45-year-old versus a 60-year-old, right? So so
now I feel so guilty.
no I think the kinds of thought experiments that you were talking about, I think are fun to do. Another way that I approach this is to really in the classroom to really focus on having the students reflect on how they are constructing themselves, what aspects of identity and background and their social roles and their interests and so forth are they using to build a sense of self around. And so that's a way of kind of like both cluing them into the fact that they are doing this process, that they are building new selves, in their early college years, while also really pointing out the constructed nature of that process, right? That self isn't something that's necessarily inherently there, but it's something that you're building and crafting and creating. So it's more of a verb than it is a sort of a permanently existing kind of entity. So anyway, that's an approach that I often take in that particular section of the class.
I love it.
To draw it. Yeah.
Do you have any other thoughts on? I want to talk about your other book a little bit as well, because it's rare to have somebody have two brand new books come on the podcast at the same time. But do you have any other thoughts on Buddhish, about the rollout or the last several months, and any feedback that you've gotten that you were really happy with, or any thoughts you've had since the book has come out?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say that the timing of these two books, it's actually a little bit kind of overwhelming for me. And it had to do with the supply chain shortages of paper in the that affected the publishing industry. So Buddhish got delayed a little bit in coming out. But anyway, the thing I was going to add about Buddhish, I don't think I've said yet, is that one of the main kind of groups of people that I was interested in reaching with the book is people who have a meditation practice, maybe a mindfulness practice, maybe it could be a vipassana practice like I had, that are, getting benefit in their lives from meditation, but haven't necessarily taken the step to becoming more informed or more aware of the Buddhist tradition more generally. And it can be really overwhelming to know sort of where to start, because Buddhism is such a huge, hugely diverse tradition with all these different schools and sects and cultures and languages. And I think it's often overwhelming for people to know kind of where to start with their interest in Buddhism. And so, often their choices are random. They go to the bookstore and they pick up maybe it's a book by the Dalai Lama, maybe it's a book by, a Theravada Buddhist monk or who knows, right? So one of the things I was hoping this book would do would be to be able to provide people with kind of like an introductory overview. I talk about all the various schools and traditions and sort of put them on the map. So then somebody who's interested in learning more would know where to start and have some key terms and some ideas about where they would like to go next. At the very least, kind of discriminating between Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, and then sort of modernist forms of Buddhism.
You mentioned your own practice with Theravada when you went to Thailand. Was that like simply because, did you land on that because that's where you landed while you were traveling? Was that sort of like a practice of convenience and location?
Correct. Yes. I just happened to be scuba diving in the south of Thailand and heard about meditation retreat in central Thailand. And so that's where I went. So it could have turned out completely differently had I been scuba diving, if there was scuba diving off the coast of Korea or something like that, right? It could have turned out a completely different story.
I love it. Well, it definitely, forged a new life path, which I love how those turning points emerge within our lives. If I look back at like the major moments where my life went in a completely different direction, that's the best stuff to think back on. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's something I always emphasize to my students too, right? Because young people are often in this sort of like, conveyor belt from high school to college to their first job and just into their, home owning and child rearing lives. And, I, for whatever reason, I had this kind of hiatus for 5 or 6 years between between college and graduate school, where I really got to, explore my interests and explore the world. It's a huge, privilege to be able to do that. I'm really, really grateful that I had that opportunity, because there's no way that I would have decided to set out on this particular research trajectory or this particular career or this particular life if I didn't have that opportunity to sort of look around and experiment a little bit.
I would co-sign all of that if it was written down. Because my life had some similar turning points like that as well that I will forever be grateful for, which honestly led me down the path of creating a show like this. Without certain points in my life, this would not exist. So I love thinking back on moments like that. But let's turn a little bit to your other new book, which is called A Global History of Buddhism and Medicine, which is out now from Columbia University Press. And I was poking through it, and one of the reviewers, William McGrath, said, quote, "A global history of Buddhism and medicine provides an overarching narrative for the burgeoning field of Buddhist medical studies. Salguero successfully synthesizes several millennia of intellectual developments that took place across diverse traditions and cultures into a single coherent narrative." And I would love to know about your interest in Buddhism's connection to medicine, as like a starting point, and then have you kind of work into how this grand scope of a book took shape for you, because this seems like a tremendously large project that you took on, and here it is right in front of me.
Yeah. So I did mention how my experience in Southeast Asia was very much kind of seeing the intersections between Buddhism and health, between Buddhism and Asian medicine practice. So from the very beginning of my experience with Buddhism, I have always seen it as being kind of inextricably intertwined with health and healing. And once I came back to the US and went into graduate school, that became sort of the focal point for my research. And, I eventually got a PhD in the history of medicine, with a particular eye towards, the connections between Buddhism and medicine. And I switched between doing my master's and my PhD to focus on medieval China. So I wrote my dissertation on Buddhist medicine in medieval China. Did the language training to be able to read the scriptures from that period and other texts, and sort of focused on medieval China for the for my dissertation and my first academic book. But all along, since I already had this background in Thailand, I was already always interested in this kind of the similarities that I saw, or the comparison between medieval China and contemporary Thailand. So this was always in the back of my mind as something that was a curiosity, and something that was interesting to study further. So once my first book came out and I got tenure at my college, I decided to take on what seemed to me at the time to be a sort of an impossible task, which was to try to produce some kind of comparative global history of Buddhism and medicine. And at the time, I'm saying it was an impossible task because we did have scholarship on this topic, but it was very disparate. Anthropologists working in Tibet were publishing, in some venues, where historians of medieval China were publishing in other venues, and those bodies of scholarship weren't talking to each other, and they weren't talking to the contemporary Southeast Asian scholarship, and they weren't talking to the mindfulness research. It's really sort of a very diffuse field, if you could even call it a field. So about 10 years ago, I started working on a project. It eventually became 2 volumes of translations that were contributed by, I think, 86 scholars, also published by Columbia University Press. And it's a collection of translations of texts from across the world, from the very earliest Pali texts all the way through to contemporary texts and interviews with contemporary practitioners from all around the world, all around different Buddhist cultures, speaking to all of the various ways that Buddhism and medicine have overlapped in various times and places. As those 2 volumes came out, meanwhile, I was doing a lot of reading of the secondary scholarship, but it really took the 10 years for me to feel like there was enough of that I had enough of an understanding of the sort of the big picture, from both the reading the scholarship and also from having all of these texts translated. So then I felt that I was able to take on writing this book, and this book is really sort of a weaving together of all of that material. So it's weaving together my own research, as well as research of, for decades of research of other scholars, and then weaving in all of these texts that have been translating as well, to do what Bill, in the quote that you read, says that I did successfully, which I appreciate that. But
Yeah.
what I was trying to do was synthesize all of this material into a single coherent narrative to bring it all together into one kind of picture of the history of Buddhism and medicine.
Wonderful. And this is a very, very new topic for me, Buddhism and the connection to medicine. And I'm just wondering if there's any like important vocabulary or concept that is important to distinguish if there is a Buddhism and medicine or Buddhist medicine. Is there any like clarifications or any ideas that you think are really important for people to consider going into a book like this?
Yeah, that's great that you picked up on that. That's that is a topic and a question that has come up again and again and again since I began working on this project. The books, the 3 books from Columbia University Press, including this most recent one that's tying it all together, have the phrase Buddhism and medicine in the title. So the other 2 are Anthology of Buddhism and Medicine, and this is a global history of Buddhism and medicine. But by the time the 3rd book was being written, I, in the introduction, commit strongly to using the term Buddhist medicine. And to be clear, the way I'm using that term is a little bit like we could use the term Buddhist art, let's say. Mm-hmm. So the term Buddhist art isn't pointing to a specific tradition or a specific school of art. It's a category that we can use to bring together art that's being produced in very radically different contexts. Like, for example, a Silk Road statue and a contemporary Japanese manga. If they both are depicting the Buddha or other Buddhist themes, we could analyze them together under this category of Buddhist art, and it would help us to see how they're participating in a larger tradition and how they might be, speaking to one another across centuries. Or it allows us a framework to be able to compare or to look at similarities in how they're constructed or conceived of. And anyway, thinking in terms of Buddhist medicine for me points to it's Buddhist medicine it's not a specific kind of practice or a specific idea about healing, but rather it's a field, right, where it allows us to bring together the different ways that different cultures have thought about the relationship between Buddhism and medicine. And it allows us to look at commonalities or differences. It allows us to compare across cultures and across times, and to see some commonalities to emerge or some differences. This is my attempt to provide a terminology that can be both broad enough to encompass all of this diversity of different ways that Buddhists have thought about health and healing, but then also sort of focus us in on some of the commonalities as well.
I love it. Well, and something that really struck me as well about your book is that you have a section about contemporary Buddhist medicine. And, by now, most listeners of this podcast will have learned about some of the clinical studies in meditation or how it's used in psychotherapy. I talked to Dr. Ira Helderman a while back on this podcast for his book, Prescribing the Dharma, where he talks about, psychotherapy techniques. And I'm wondering if you can talk to me a little bit about that current state of contemporary Buddhism and the medical field in the here and now that you kind of overview in that chapter.
Yeah. So I know Ira well, we're friends, and I, cite his work in there as well. I think a lot of scholars recently have been really closely analyzing and problematizing in many ways the science that you're talking about. And I in the chapter I sort of summarize the state of that scholarship as I see it, but then I also pivot towards a broader appreciation for the contemporary state of Buddhist medicine. So, for example, by talking about a much wider range of meditations, it's really, mindfulness that gets the most attention. Maybe compassion meditation gets a little bit of attention too, but throughout the book, I talk about all kinds of different meditations that Buddhists have proposed and used for health and healing purposes that may or may not be studied by the scientific medical field. And then beyond that, connections between contemporary Buddhism and traditional Asian medicine. So around the world, there's traditions like Thai medicine that I was talking about earlier, but also Tibetan medicine, Cambodian and Burmese medicine that are contemporary forms of traditional medicine that are practiced widely in those countries that are very much derived from or engaged with Buddhist ideas. There's Buddhist rituals happening, related to health and healing all over the contemporary world. And we really saw that with the emergence of the COVID pandemic, the importance of ritual interventions in Buddhist countries all over the world. And that's the epilogue of the book talks about COVID. And then all kinds of different ways that Buddhists are interfacing and integrating with biomedicine, from charitable institutions that are building hospitals to monks that are consulting with scientists and public health officials and so forth. So it's just a huge range of different ways that that's the point. It's just a huge range of different ways that Buddhism and medicine continue to intersect today. And Buddhism is a big part of contemporary medicine and public health around the world, including here in Philadelphia. I've done a research project with students for the last 6 years or so, where we've been doing interviews at Buddhist temples right here in Philadelphia. And we've been to 45 or so temples, and nearly every single one of them has talked to us about how the temple is engaged with healthcare and well-being for the members in various different kinds of ways.
I love it. Well, and I'm wondering if you can talk to me a little bit about what you see the health sciences struggling with in relation to Buddhism, and maybe what they're doing well. Is there like a few struggle areas and a few success areas that you're kind of picking up on in your studies?
Yeah, I'm really excited about the research you were referring to earlier about the clinical studies on the benefits of meditation. I think that's really exciting research. And if we can learn from an ancient tradition how to help with contemporary ailments, and do so in a way that is inexpensive and natural, I'm very much in favor of that. And I think that the research is it's as much attention as the research has gotten, it still is in its infancy. And I think it's gonna take many more years before we have a real clear picture of a detailed picture of how best to use meditation clinically. But I'm really excited about the direction that's been going in. And in terms of downsides, I mean, in addition to the larger point that I was just making, that sort of, all of the attention to meditation might be sucking all the oxygen out of the room for all of the other ways that Buddhism might be able to contribute to, or is contributing to, health and well-being around the world. So that's a potential downside. But another potential downside is something that's been emerging more recently in just the last couple of years from the meditation research that I don't think has been really explored quite yet, which is the potential for negative side effects from intensive meditation practice. And it's something that we're just starting to get some publications from clinical studies that are talking about this. And when I saw those coming out, I was fascinated by that. And also it reminded me that, meditation illness or meditation sickness is a category of illness that has been around for at least 1,500 years. As I have a medieval Chinese text from the 5th century that talks about the negative side effects, the potential negative side effects of intensive meditation, and then give some ideas on how to help people that have those conditions. And so, it's an area, just another area, or I guess a specific case where the medical research or the clinical research is starting to discover something that has a long history of being spoken about and addressed within the Buddhist tradition. So I think sometimes the health sciences, clinical researchers might be more open to looking to the historians and the anthropologists for some indications on where the pitfalls might be for the types of interventions that they're interested in.
Gotcha. Well, Dr. Salguero, I am very, enthused by the fact that we've been able to talk about 2 books, Buddhish, which is for a very wide readership and mainstream reader and audience. But then we also have a global history of Buddhism and medicine, which is a very specific academic text. And this is just such a fascinating conversation. I'm wondering if you have any other projects you'd like to promote or anything like that you'd like for listeners to know about or to direct their attention to if they'd like to know more about your work.
Yeah, well, I am launching now a project on meditation illness that I was just speaking about. So cool. I'm hoping to bring together a group of scholars again, like I have in the past, to do sort of a mass translation project where we would be able to bring texts from historical Buddhist traditions that have either diagnostic or treatment relevance for these conditions, to be able to bring them into English and be able to put them out into the world for people to benefit from. So that's kind of like next on the docket for my projects. And I did want to say, the Global History of Buddhism and Medicine book is more academic than Buddhish, for sure. Buddhish is written, like we said, for general audience and young college students, and Global History is much more for people who know about Buddhism, who are invested in Buddhism, either academically or practice. But I did try to write it in a way that was accessible for a wider audience, and it is available in paperback. So it's not sort of the traditional, really expensive academic kind of monograph. I did try to make it something that would be readable and be accessible. So I think a lot of people are going to be interested in this topic, that have a background, let's say, in practicing mindfulness or Vipassana or something like that, and or they're psychologists or they're clinicians of some kind, and not historians. So I wanted to make that a book that would appeal sort of across disciplines in that way.
I love it. Well, it has been such a delight chatting with you today, Dr. Pierce Salguero, author of Buddhish and also A Global History of Buddhism and Medicine. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm very honored to be a guest on your podcast, and I really appreciate all the questions, and thanks for reading.